I still remember the smell of the roasted turkey filling my small kitchen, the glow of the Christmas tree lights bouncing against the window, and the way I set the table so carefully. 3 plates, 3 sets of silverware, 3 glasses polished until they sparkled. My hands shook a little, not from age, but from excitement. You see, this was supposed to be the first Christmas dinner with my son and his wife in years. I had planned everything. I even wore the old red sweater my late wife once said made me look festive. But as the hours ticked by, the candles melted into wax puddles, and the food turned cold. My phone buzzed once, a short message from my son. "Sorry, Dad, we're spending Christmas with her family this year. Maybe next time." Just like that. No call. No explanation. Just a text. My heart clenched so tight I thought it might stop right there. I sat in silence, staring at the empty chairs across from me, the ones I had imagined filled with laughter. And that night, staring at the untouched dinner, I whispered to myself, "They think I'm forgotten. But they're wrong." I wasn't born into comfort, and I sure as hell didn't live with much luxury. But I always had one thing: responsibility. When my wife passed away far too early, I was left standing in a small, creaky house with a little boy who still slept with his toy truck tucked under his arm. My son. He was only 7, and in that moment I promised him 2 things: that I'd never let him go hungry, and that I'd be both his mother and his father. I didn't know how I was going to manage it, but I swore it on my wife's grave. Every morning I was up before dawn, heading to the factory, my hands raw from lifting steel and my back aching from 12-hour shifts. I'd come home with grease on my face and exhaustion in my bones, but the second my son came running into my arms shouting, "Dad!" it made every ache worth it. I remember staying up late, even after my shifts, sewing back buttons on his school shirts because I couldn't afford new ones. I learned how to braid hair clumsily when he begged me to practice on his action figures. I learned how to cook more than instant noodles because he deserved hot meals. When he was sick, I sat by his bed all night, holding a damp cloth to his forehead, whispering stories about his mother, so he would never forget the woman who loved him first. When he wanted to play baseball, I worked extra hours to buy him a second-hand glove, and I sat proudly in the bleachers at every single game, yelling until my throat went raw. I didn't care if my shoes were falling apart, or if my winter coat had holes. As long as he had what he needed, that was enough for me. There were times when the fridge was nearly empty, but I made sure he never noticed. I'd tell him I wasn't hungry, when really my stomach growled all night. I pawned my old wedding ring to pay for his school trip because I didn't want him to be the only kid left behind. I remember watching him leave. On that bus, his face pressed to the window, waving at me with pure excitement. And even though my chest ached at parting with that ring, I felt proud that I could give him something to remember. As he grew older, I worked even harder. I scraped together enough money to buy him his first car. Not new, but safe enough to get him to school and back. I paid every installment for his college education, even when it meant skipping repairs on the house or eating canned soup for weeks. When he got married, I welcomed his wife with open arms, thinking I had gained another child, not lost one. I gave them the down payment for their home, drained my savings to make sure they had stability. I told myself, this is what fathers do. They give and give and give. But what I didn't tell anyone was how lonely it all felt when the house grew quieter. When my son stopped sitting at the dinner table with me and instead rushed off to be with friends, I would sit with his empty plate across from me, chewing slowly, convincing myself this was just how children grew. When birthdays came and went with only a quick call, I smiled into the phone, pretending it didn't sting. When holidays felt smaller and smaller, I told myself it was just life moving forward. And yet I clung to the little joys, the sound of his laughter echoing from old home videos I sometimes played late at night, the framed photo of his graduation sitting proudly on the mantel, reminding me that every sacrifice had meant something. The phone calls, though rare, when he called me Dad, in that old affectionate tone, they warmed me like sunlight. I convinced myself that no matter how busy he became, no matter how far he drifted, He would always come back to me when it truly mattered. I never remarried because I thought no one could love my son the way I did. I never moved to a bigger house, even when I had the chance, because I wanted him to always have a place to return to, a place filled with memories, warmth, and the smell of the meals I once cooked for him as a boy. I lived my entire life not for myself, but for him, pouring every ounce of love and sacrifice into making sure he had more than I ever did. And yet, as I grew older, the silence of the house grew heavier. Nights felt longer, winters colder, dinners lonelier. I kept setting the table for two, even when only I sat down. I would stir soup slowly, half expecting him to walk in like he used to after school. The truth is, I gave everything, my youth, my health, my money, my love, for my family. And even when the world felt heavy on my shoulders, I carried it with pride, because I thought one day, when I was old and tired, they would carry me back with their love. I believed in that promise more than anything. But belief can be the cruelest trick of all. I remember the exact moment the first knife went in, a short text, cold and casual. "Sorry, Dad, we're spending Christmas with her family this year. Maybe next time." My hands froze above the plate, the turkey steam curled, and the words on my phone did not. For a little while I thought it was a joke. I laughed out loud at the kitchen too, able like a fool, pretending the lump in my throat wasn't real. Then the laughter died, and the house smelled of gravy and disappointment. That night I sat with my back to the window and listened to the clock tick like a jury counting down. The next morning I called him, because that's what fathers do. They reach out, even when their palms are trembling. "Son," I said, trying to make my voice steady, "did you get my invitation?" There was a long pause, and then he said without warmth, "Dad, we made plans. We can't always be at your place." "We?" I asked. "Who's we?" His wife's voice floated in the background, sharp and laughing. "We decided she'd be with her family this year. It's what we do." I felt my mouth go dry. "You could have told me," I said. I set the table. He answered like I was a weather report. "Sorry, Dad, it's complicated." Complicated. The word felt like a slap. I wanted to cry. I wanted to beg. Instead, I listened as his tone closed like a door. She called me once at the house months earlier, a thin, rehearsed politeness that faltered into something colder when she thought I wouldn't hear. "You seem lonely," she said, then laughed. "Maybe find another hobby." Find another hobby. As if grief and time and all the nights I held a sleeping child in my lap were hobbies to be replaced. They started bringing her family over more. Big dinners, loud toasts, and perfectly filtered photos. I would sit on the edge of the couch, while the laughter from their visits leaked into the hallway and into my bones. One Thanksgiving she said in front of everyone, "It's sweet you want to help, but we manage. Don't meddle." I sank back into the chair like a man who'd been told twice he had no place at the table. When I asked about the mortgage payment I had helped with, my son's face tightened and he said, "We don't need to go over old things, Dad." Old things. Those bricks and papers and signatures I had signed were old things to them. I watched them at weddings and birthdays smiling beside them, and realized my name was a ghost in their albums. They would take my presents and never look at me the way children look at the hands that buy them toys. At his birthday last year, I baked a cake and waited in my kitchen hoping he'd swing by. He texted a photo instead, him and his wife, clinking glasses, captioned, "Living our best life." I felt a hollow ache open in my chest like the space under a missing tooth. There were times I'd drop by unannounced, foolish hope making me brave, and she would answer the door with irritation, like I'd rung to collect a bill. "What do you want now?" she asked once in front of his friends. I held my head high and said, "To see my son." Her friends snorted and said, "He's been busy, Mr. Thompson. You should understand." I understood too well. I understood the months of missed calls, the birthday cards that arrived late, the holidays outsourced to other homes. I remember handing them the money for the down payment and feeling proud, watching them sign the papers with shaking, eager hands. They moved into the house, and I painted a wall for them, because that's what you do when you love someone. You help build their life. Then, slowly, without storms, their thanks turned into demands, and then into silence. I would catch her watching me with narrowed eyes at family gatherings, as if I was a cost-benefit problem unsolved. Once, at a barbecue, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe he should stop making everything about him." I felt every eye in the yard flick like moths to a flame and then dart away. My son shrugged, embarrassed. "Dad, come on." Embarrassed. I had given him a life and he was ashamed of me. The worst cut was when she called me a freeloader in a message that I somehow found, cruel words saved like receipts. "You live here for free, and you expect everything," it read. "You should get help." Get help. As if the steady, tired hands that had raised him needed a label instead of dinner. I remember sitting in the car, the steering wheel cold beneath my palms, reading that message again and again until the letters blurred. I tried to confront them once. I drove to their house and stood at the curb until someone came to the door. Her father, smiling and loud, opened the door and looked at me like I'd crashed the party. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I want to see my son," I said, and for a second I thought I saw shame flash across my son's face. He ushered me inside like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. They offered me a chair, a cup of coffee, but not a real conversation. At the table she leaned in and whispered, "He's stressed at work. Don't make it worse." Don't make it worse. As if the man who'd built their lives was an obstacle to their comfort. Months went by where my calls went unanswered or were returned with a limp voicemail. "Hey, Dad, can't talk now." When I once said, "I just wish you'd visit," he said, "We have jobs, responsibilities. You'll understand when you're older." I wanted to tell him I was older before he was, that I had carried responsibilities for decades while he chased college degrees and promotions. Once at a small family gathering, she stood and clinked a glass and said, "To family who actually supports each other." Her sister smiled and nodded, and in the ripple of agreement, no one looked at me. That day, someone took a picture, and she posted it with the caption, "Family is everything." I scrolled through the images and felt the betrayal in my bones, because every one of those smiling faces sat at a table I had helped build. I remembered the nights I counted pennies to buy groceries, the winter I wore 3 sweaters so my son could have a new coat. I remembered the hours I skipped sitting with friends so I could tutor him for tests, the job I took that meant less pay and more time at home. I had given up promotions so I could be at his school plays. I had given up vacations so he could go to summer camp with the other kids. And they called me a burden. They called my care clinginess. They treated memory and sacrifice like debts owed to silence. The shock turned into disbelief when his wife, at a holiday brunch, said with a laugh, "He's so needy sometimes. You know how it is." I sat there with my fork in my hand, and the room tilted like a ship taking on water. I left early that day, pretending a cough, but when I got home I sat in the dark and let the anger grow, slow as ivy. It wasn't only word. It was the way they withheld time like a currency they seldom spent on me. It was the way they flaunted vacations, bought gadgets and trips with money that I had helped supply, and never once offered to repay the man who had pawned his watch for their wedding. I found bank statements one afternoon by mistake. Small transfers here, late-night charges there, things I had covered without complaint. Seeing their charges spelled out made my chest tighten with a new, bitter clarity. They had taken from me like children taking cookies when no one watched. I remember the night I sat at the dining table, lights dim, and whispered to the empty chair, "You ate from my hands, and now you look at me as if I stole from you." By then the sadness had burned into something harder. I felt hollowed out, and then filled with a slow, cold fury. Every polite excuse they offered, busy, tired, complicated, stacked like stones until there was a wall between us. The wall became a mirror. I could see my own face in it, older, smaller, and finally furious in a way I had never allowed myself to be. They had taken more than my money. They had taken my dignity with a casualness that stunned me. And when Christmas came, and the chairs remained empty, the message simple and clean, I understood the full measure of their betrayal. They had not simply chosen another house for the holiday. They had chosen to erase me from the part of their life that mattered most. I sat with the cold turkey and the empty wine glass and felt the slow burn of being replaced. Shame crept in, not mine, but the kind that feels like someone else's hand pushing you off the stage. I replayed every small slight like a gramophone scratch until my disbelief hardened into a plan that I would not speak of aloud yet. And when they posted that smiling photo with the caption, "Family is everything," I laughed, a short, wild sound, because they had sidestepped truth with perfect filters and glossy lies. I had given them floors to stomp on and a roof to sing under, and they had repaid me with a message and a shrug. That is betrayal, slow, careful, and all the more devastating because it looks to everyone else like ordinary life. I lay awake that night, counting the ways I'd been used, the dinners I'd cooked, the loans I'd co-signed, the nights I'd stayed up worrying alone. Shock had passed. Sadness had wasted me. Disbelief had become a bitter teacher. Anger now sat in my chest like a steady drum. And the anger, quiet and terrible, began to make a sound. You will not forget this. It was a cold night, one of those nights where even the walls seemed to shiver. I sat alone in the living room, the glow of the Christmas tree still flickering in the corner, even though the holiday had long passed. The ornaments sparkled, but to me they looked hollow, mocking. Every twinkle reminded me of what should have been laughter, voices, warmth. But instead was silence. I scrolled through my phone again, knowing it would hurt, and yet unable to stop myself. There it was, photo after photo of my son and his wife at her parents' grand table. Glasses raised, plates overflowing, smiles plastered across their faces. The caption, "Family is everything." Family is everything. I whispered the words to myself, tasting the bitterness. Family is everything? And what am I? Nothing. My voice cracked in the empty room, and the echo came back like an accusation. My chest tightened with grief. I thought about the nights I had gone hungry so he could eat. I thought about the cold winters where I patched his shoes instead of buying my own. I thought about all the hours in factories, the sweat, the pain in my back, and how I had given it all so that he could sit in those pictures with a full plate. At first, grief swallowed me. I felt small, invisible, like a ghost haunting the life I had built. Tears slipped down my face, hot against the cold of the room. I asked myself, was it worth it? Was every sacrifice for nothing? But then something shifted inside me. The sadness didn't last long. It couldn't. The longer I stared at those photos, the more the tears dried and something darker took their place. My hands clenched into fists without me realizing it. The ache in my chest hardened into something sharper. I leaned forward in my chair, staring at the tree until the lights blurred. My thoughts turned one after another. They used me. They disrespected me. They threw me away. And then the rage began to boil. How dare they, I muttered, my voice shaking. How dare they sit there at that table eating, laughing, while I sit here alone in the house that built them? Every memory that once brought me comfort now cut like a blade. Him as a boy, running to me with scraped knees. Him as a teenager, holding the car keys I bought. Him at graduation, wearing the gown I paid for. Him moving into the house I helped him secure. And yet, in return, I was cast aside like yesterday's newspaper. My breathing grew heavier, slower. The grief turned into something more solid, determination. A thought formed, sharp as glass. They think I'm weak because I'm old. They think they can discard me. But they've forgotten who made them strong in the first place. I stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. My legs trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of my decision. I walked to the window and looked out into the darkness, the night swallowing the street, and I said it out loud, steady and cold. Enough is enough. The words rang in the silence, heavier than any prayer I had ever spoken. I felt my grief dissolve, drop by drop, until all that was left was fire. My heart no longer begged for their love. It no longer pleaded for recognition. Instead, it demanded justice. I looked at the pictures one more time, their smiling faces frozen on the screen, and I whispered, "Enjoy it while you can, because soon you'll remember the man you tried to erase." That night, lying in bed, I didn't toss or turn with sorrow like before. I planned. I thought about every thread that tied their life to mine, every contract, every dollar, every silent sacrifice they had taken for granted. I had been patient for too long, silent for too long, ignored for too long, but not anymore. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not from love, not from pride, but from the clarity of knowing what I had to do. I closed my eyes, clenched my jaw, and made a vow, whispered into the dark like a promise written in stone. They abandoned me at Christmas. They left me with nothing but silence. Now I will show them what it feels like to lose everything. And from that moment on, revenge wasn't just a thought. It was my mission. I began quietly, the way a good storm begins, with a long, slow breath. Fur. City. I stopped reacting. Silence became my armor. I put the phone down and let the noise of their life fill the room without me. While they celebrated, I did what I had never done. I listened to the small, practical sounds of my own house. I opened drawers that I hadn't touched in years and pulled out old papers, photocopies, and receipts. There were deeds, signatures, contracts folded and yellowed at the edges. I spread them across the kitchen table and read them like a man reading the lines of his future. I hired a lawyer, not the loud kind with a billboard, but an old, careful woman who smelled of coffee and books. She did not promise fireworks. She promised precision. We read clauses until the words blurred, and then we read them again. There were signatures I had forgotten, guarantees I had made in sleep, and ownership threads that still bore my name. I began to catalog everything, who owed what, who benefited from my name, and what pieces of their life still depended on me. Next, I rebuilt relationships I had neglected for reasons of pride and stubbornness. The bank manager who used to nod to me in the lobby remembered me when I visited with a quiet smile and a patient explanation. An old friend from the contracting days answered when I knocked on his door and listened without judgment. I met with a neighbor who had been like a brother and traded stories for small favors and facts. I did not tell them my plan. I only asked questions and left with information tucked into my coat, like tools. Because revenge, I had learned, is most effective when it is well informed. I visited the city records office on a damp Tuesday and read property records like a detective. I did not speak loudly. I wrote notes on the back of old receipts and stepped out into the rain with my head bent over the paper. I made discreet phone calls to accountants, the kind of calls that sound like routine checks but are really careful probes. I learned about liabilities and guarantees and where a person's name can anchor another's fortune. At night I made lists. I checked them twice, like an old habit learned from better days. I started to seed doubt without appearing to act. I asked casual questions of family friends at church and in the market. "Isn't it risky to rely on one person?" I would say, and then listen as they filled in their opinions for me. Small things, a misplaced checkbook here, a missed signature there. I let them notice and then forget. I quietly reconnected with her distant relative, the one who resented how quickly she had moved up in the family hierarchy. We did not make plans over coffee. We traded memories and grudges can be ingredients. I paid attention to social media, not to rage, but to patterns. Where they flaunted, they were weak. Where they hid, there was guilt. I invited an old colleague who owed me a favor to dinner and asked about the business I had started decades ago. He spoke freely after a glass of wine and revealed small vulnerabilities in the company I had built. Things I could not ethically exploit, but things I could use to remind people who had the original claim. I arranged documents in neat stacks: legal, financial, personal. I labeled them like a man labeling the pieces of a puzzle. I practiced conversations in my head. The meeting at the table would be calm, deliberate, and final. I learned patience, which is a different kind of power. I waded through seasons and moods, watching them make their mistakes. They were careless in little ways, bragging too loudly about purchases, assuming my silence was weakness. That arrogance became a map. I traced it carefully. I did not want to humiliate them in public without cause. I wanted them to feel the absence of what they had taken for granted. So I began to untangle the safety nets they didn't know they were using. I reviewed old loan documents and wrote down where my name still tethered theirs to stability. I consulted the lawyer about what was legal, what was ethical, and where the lines blurred so thin they could be walked without crossing into darkness. She reminded me that justice need not be violence. She reminded me that truth spoken carefully can topple illusions. I gathered witnesses, not to stage a scene, but to confirm facts. A mechanic who remembered payments, a teacher who recalled my presence at school events, and an ex-business partner who could attest to my early investments. Their testimonies were simple, proof that I had built more than memories. I had created assets that supported their comfort. I wrote letters, not angry ones, but letters that documented what I had done and what I expected. One letter went to the business board with a calm request for a meeting. Another quietly asked the bank to audit old guarantees. I did not shout. I did not throw accusations like gravel in the road. I placed papers on desks and let bureaucracy do its slow work. There were nights I nearly lost my nerve. I sat with a cup of tea and wondered if I had become the kind of person I once swore I wouldn't be. Then I remembered the nights of cold beans and broken promises, and the resolve settled again like iron. I practiced my face in the mirror, not to make it cruel, but to ensure it held the calm of a man who would not be baited. I knew timing mattered, so I watched their calendar, their vacations, the rhythms of their comfort. I waited for an opening, a month, when expenses were due, when pride would push them to ask rather than admit. My allies were careful. They gave me pieces of information like old coins, small, polished, and valuable. I kept secret meetings at the diner down the street, where the waitresses thought me charming and forgetful. I paid in cash and listened to the conversations around me, gleaning a sense of what others thought of the family now. When I needed an action that required muscle, I turned to the contractor friend who still respected me for how I'd helped him once. He would move slowly, and only where it was legal and visible, a reminder that the tapestries of their comforts had threads I could touch. I planted the idea of a meeting between her father and the bank manager without mentioning names. Rumors are often the first foot in the door. I made sure not to burn bridges I might need to cross later. Silence is a tightrope walk. Make too much noise and everyone looks up. There were evenings I sat with the photo of their smiling faces and drew diagrams of pathways, legal, social, financial, that connected us. I kept a small notebook with precise notes. Dates, conversations, the weight of a sigh. Each line was a step toward clarity. I never told my son anything of this. He deserved the shock. He deserved to see that a man can stop being taken for granted. When I first handed a formal letter to the bank, my hands trembled, but the lawyer's steady presence steadied me. It was a quiet nudge, a request to review past guarantees. But the ripples it made was enough to unsettle the table. They called me the next week, nervous, trying to mask worry with bravado. I listened and smiled and said nothing. I bought myself small comforts too, because revenge without dignity is hollow. A haircut, a new shirt, a clean pair of shoes. I wanted to be seen when the time came, not as a ghost, but as a man who had been wronged and had the courage to stand. There were nights I rehearsed the moment I would present the facts at the table. I imagined their faces, the color leaving their cheeks, the silence that would follow. But the exact shape of the final step remained folded, like a letter I was saving for the right day. I let them believe I was dwindling into old age. I let them use my name without question. I let their arrogance grow like a vine. Because the bigger the vine, the more satisfying the cut when it comes down. Every day, I tightened a link, untied a knot, and left no trace of my work aside from faint ripples in their tidy life. They never suspected that the old man who cooked dinners alone had learned how to move in nearly invisible ways. And all the while I kept one thought at the center of everything. Truth, not vengeance, will be my sword. When the moment comes, I will not scream it from the rooftops. I will place the evidence on the table and watch as their comfort unravels under the weight of facts. They will have no theatrics to deflect with, only the knowledge that their ease came at my expense. I could feel the plan settling into itself, a machine wound and waiting for its key. I slept better now, not from peace, but from the satisfaction of purpose. And in the quiet of those nights, I rehearsed my final vow. I would not break them beyond repair, only remind them of what they had been given and what they chose to throw away. The rest I kept to myself. If you ask me now what I am planning, I will smile and say, "You'll see." And that uncertainty, that question hanging in the air, what is he really planning, was precisely the point. That Christmas night burned a hole in my soul, but as the days passed, that fire inside me turned into something sharper, something they would never expect. My son thought abandoning me was the end of the story, but he had no idea it was just the beginning. The first step of my revenge was silence. I didn't call. I didn't beg. I didn't even let him know how broken I was. Instead, I smiled when neighbors asked about him, and I nodded politely when relatives mentioned how lucky he was to have such a devoted father. They didn't know I was already planning. In my quiet house, with the Christmas lights still hanging, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down every sacrifice I had ever made for him. The nights I worked double shifts, the times I went without food, the money I gave him when I should have saved for myself. Every line hardened me more, sharpening my resolve. I began with the finances. My son believed that because I was old and quiet, I didn't know how to protect myself. He was wrong. Years of working had left me with savings, investments, and a small property or two he knew nothing about. I went to the bank and locked everything down. My will, rewritten. Every cent, every piece of land, every heirloom stripped away from his future. Instead, I named charities, old friends, even distant cousins who had shown me kindness. My son's name? Erased. Step by step, I cut him out of the very legacy he thought he was entitled to. But that wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel humiliation, the same way he made me feel at that dinner. So I waited until his wife's family hosted their grand New Year's party, a gathering they bragged about all over town. I dressed in my best suit, the one I had saved for rare occasions, and I arrived with a calm smile. When they saw me at the door, my son's face froze. His wife whispered sharply, "Why is he here?" He stuttered, "Dad, I thought—" I cut him off gently. "I just came to return something." Their confusion was delicious. I walked to the center of the room, where their in-laws were laughing and drinking. I raised my voice just enough to hush the crowd. "This year," I began, "I had planned a Christmas dinner for my family. I cooked for hours, set the table, poured my heart into it. But my son and his wife never showed, not even a phone call." Gasps filled the room, and all eyes turned to them. My son's face went pale. His wife tried to laugh it off. "Oh, he exaggerates, he's dramatic." But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the small box I had brought. Inside was a photo of my late wife holding our newborn son, framed with love and memory. I held it high. This is the boy I raised with every ounce of strength I had. This is the man I worked myself sick to provide for. And yet, he left me alone on Christmas night. The silence was thick enough to choke on. My son reached for me, whispering, "Dad, please stop." But I wasn't stopping. Then came the twist. I unfolded a set of documents, proof that every property, every account, every bit of inheritance had been redirected. "You see," I said, my voice steady as stone, "I used to think family was everything. But I've learned that true family isn't blood, it's loyalty, respect, love. And since I received none of that from you," I handed the papers to his in-laws. "You should all know, he will inherit nothing, not a dime. He abandoned me, now I abandon him." The room erupted. His wife's parents looked horrified, whispering to each other about the embarrassment. His wife's face twisted with fury, her dreams of wealth crumbling in real time. My son stammered, "You can't do this. Dad, I'm your son." I looked him straight in the eye. "A son doesn't abandon his father. You made your choice when you left me alone on Christmas." The whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. He left his father on Christmas? What kind of man does that? Shameful. The humiliation I had carried was now his to bear, magnified tenfold. He was exposed, cornered, stripped of dignity. And I felt lighter than I had in years. But the final strike was yet to come. Days later, when he came pounding on my door, desperate and red-eyed, I didn't yell or curse. I simply opened the door a crack and said, "Do you remember what you told me that night? That you were too busy? That I wasn't important enough?" His lips trembled. "Dad, please, I messed up." I shook my head. "No. You taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Now it's your turn to live with it." And I shut the door, locking it behind me, not just the door of my house, but the door of my heart. That was my revenge, not just taking away his inheritance, not just humiliating him in front of everyone who mattered to him, but showing him, slowly, painfully, that the father he took for granted was gone, and that the price of betrayal is permanent. He thought I would always be waiting, always forgiving, but I wasn't, not anymore. When the dust of my revenge finally settled, I sat alone in my quiet living room, the echoes of Christmas long gone, but the weight of that night still heavy in my chest, and I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying sorrow anymore. It had been replaced by something far more powerful, closure, because in showing my son and his wife the consequences of their cruelty, I had not only defended my dignity, but reclaimed my voice, the very voice they had tried to silence when they laughed at me and called me nothing more than a burden. I looked at the empty chairs around the table, and though my heart ached at the sight, I felt no regret. For those chairs were not abandoned. They were finally free of the poison of ungratefulness. I found myself remembering the boy my son used to be, the one who would cling to my leg when he was afraid of the dark, the boy who cried when he scraped his knee and only calmed when I held him. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who had forgotten the hands that built his future. And as much as it tore me apart to admit it, I understood now that love, without respect, is nothing but chains around your soul, chains I had finally broken. The town whispered about what I had done. Some called me cruel, others called me brave, but not one of them could say I was wrong. And I noticed, quietly, that those whispers were always laced with a kind of awe, because people knew the truth. Too many parents suffer in silence, giving everything and receiving nothing. But I refused to be another silent casualty. In the days that followed, I poured my energy not into mourning what I had lost, but into rediscovering myself. I fixed the old piano in the corner and let my fingers stumble across the keys until music filled the house again, music that wasn't for anyone else's ears but mine. I started tending my garden with renewed care, each bloom a reminder that life keeps growing even after storms tear through it. And as I watched the colors burst back into my yard, I thought, this is what healing looks like. It isn't forgetting. It's choosing to keep living anyway. My son reached out eventually, his voice shaking through the phone as he asked to talk things through. But I didn't let him inside my heart so easily. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a gift handed freely to those who wound you. It is earned through remorse, consistency, and humility. And though I left the door cracked, I didn't swing it wide open, because I finally respected myself enough to set boundaries. His wife never called. Her pride was louder than her guilt, and that told me everything I needed to know about her, about how blind greed rots a soul until it can no longer see its own reflection. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if my revenge was too much, if I should have taken a gentler path, but then I remember the loneliness of that Christmas table, the food going cold while I stared at the door, waiting for people who never came, and the answer settles like steel in my bones. No, I did what needed to be done, because silence would have been the same as surrender, and I am no one's victim. My heart is not unscarred, but it beats steady and proud, and that is enough. And so my story ends not with joy, not with bitterness, but with truth. Family is not blood, it is loyalty, respect, and love, and when those are missing, you owe yourself the courage to walk away, even if it breaks you. If there is a lesson in my pain, it is this. Never let anyone, not even your own child, convince you that your worth is negotiable. We parents sacrifice, we love, we give. But we are human too, and our dignity is not up for trade. If you are listening to this, let my story remind you. Stand tall, protect your heart, and know that even in loneliness, you are never truly alone, because self-respect is the family that never abandons you.